All right, it's time now for Perspective. My guest today, writer August Cole, is at the forefront of the push to explore how emerging technologies will affect the future of warfare and defense. Through an approach he calls FICINT, he combines fiction writing and intelligence to imagine future possibilities based on our present reality. His latest book, Burn-In, follows a special agent with the FBI working with an advanced police robot to stop a futuristic enemy, an anti-technology terrorist. August, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
So could you start by telling us why the choice to mix fiction and novel form instead of just nonfiction to explore these themes?
You know, as a former journalist, it'd be a lot easier to stick with nonfiction. But one of the things that's become clear is that storytelling is one of the most effective ways to communicate not just very complex ideas, but to really stay focused on the human elements. And when you're writing about technology, when you're writing about the future of conflict, it's very easy to get lost in the details and lose sight of the really important aspects of truly understanding things from a human point of view. What useful fiction can do, this approach we call FICINT, allows you to both reach people who are very senior, who don't have time and don't want to read another white paper or look at another PowerPoint, but it also lets you speak broadly to audiences that are hopefully outside your silos as a writer. And that's crucial because many of the best ideas, whether it's innovation in technology, whether it's new concepts that have to do with society, are coming from corners that we may not otherwise look overseas within our own, cultures, et cetera. And so it's really important to have that kind of an approach to break through those sorts of barriers.
So in terms of breaking through those barriers and reaching the largest audience possible, I imagine that there's an implication there that there's some type of objective with these types of novels. What is the objective?
One of the fundamental things that is embedded into every useful fiction project is really trying to have a point, in effect, to really think about one of the issues, for example, of the day that might be the most important that people aren't examining with enough maybe skepticism or insight. You know, Burn-In, in effect, looks at this coming collision in society with the trends that are going to be ushered in by everyday robotics, artificial intelligence, that are fundamentally going to reshape everything from how we work, there'll be less of it, to the rise of, say, extremism as algorithms increasingly shape our experiences in the political and social realm.
So what do you think are the most consequential technological developments in the past couple of decades or so that you think will have the biggest impact on the course of conflict in the future?
I think certainly we're at a point where we're seeing the rise of robots in warfare, whether it is even at a very elementary level today with drones, the use of artificial intelligence to control unmanned aircraft, whether unmanned ships, submarines of the future. You're essentially going to give more autonomy, the ability for a machine to make decisions without a human. Today, we're not comfortable at a policy level saying that we'll allow machines to kill humans on the battlefield. But fundamentally, that's the kind of future we're going to, whether in the US we want to admit that or not. And it's really critical to also understand the ways that technology is changing warfare and society itself without being seen. The amount of data that we produce individually from our smartwatches, from our financial transactions, from our phones that track us constantly, that is fundamentally also going to be very, very disruptive to how we consider warfare because it will be increasingly easy to model and simulate a society and potentially influence it without ever firing a shot.
I'd like to expand upon some of the themes that you developed in that response there. The role of ethics in technological progress as it pertains to war. I don't think that anyone would advocate for a return to trench warfare, to the likes of which we saw in the First and Second World War, all the mass casualties that caused. But there's something to say for things like drones or robots, kind of turning the enemy into an abstraction and making all of us less detached from the reality of war. Do you think that we've struck an appropriate balance between saving lives, having less casualties in conflict, and not becoming too detached from what war really is?
This is a really interesting question because it goes to both the inherent tensions with some of these innovations. On one level, the drone allows greater physical distance from the target, but at the same time, the way drones work today, a human operator very often is watching with incredibly close detail the horrific act of, a missile strike. And so there's this paradox inherent in many of these technologies. Similarly, drones and other systems allow greater precision of targeting maybe the very person you're trying to kill, let's say in an apartment building. Imagine, having that ability to change history by removing, an abhorrent dictator. But at the same time, we are experiencing conflict differently through social media. And similarly, we are essentially in a position where the average population may not be as politically connected, though, to the very policies that take a nation to war. And that disconnect is very exploitable by an adversary, too, which is both a question that has very real political implications, but also operational ones. The importance of ethics overall, especially with AI, is vital. And I think about the laws of armed conflict, the just war ethic tradition, which is the ongoing discussion about what is fair on the battlefield, what do we owe civilians in due care. That is absolutely needing to be updated with these new technologies.
So speaking of things that perhaps need to be updated, is there an existing architecture in the U.S., in China, or elsewhere in Europe to analyze and plan for future technological progress in conflict?
We're seeing a lot of innovation happening when it comes to thinking about the future of conflict, especially in Western militaries. There is increasingly a realization that many of the assumptions that were built into the way Western militaries, particularly the US, are structured over the last 20 years, particularly the focus on China now as an adversary, has forced a reckoning with the idea that the US may no longer have technological supremacy on the battlefield. That's easy to say, but it's a profound revelation for America. China's own military rise is equally fascinating because their forces in the People's Liberation Army are becoming more professional and more technologically advanced. They're capable of doing things that they weren't able to before, whether it's long-distance stealth aircraft or developing hypersonic weapons that are almost impossible to shoot down. They similarly are going to have a kind of ethical conversation within their own structure, which is, of course, quite different given the People's Liberation Army is controlled by the Communist Party. My hope is that in the West, particularly in the US, that we can be standard bearers, that we can lead in the ethical conversation, in part because our international alliances require it. If you want to work collaboratively as a coalition in the future of in future conflicts, it's vital to have that ethical foundation. So organizations like NATO have a real role to play, for example, in creating at least a common framework.
And even more so now as war rages on the European continent. August Cole, thank you so much for joining us today. That's unfortunately all we have time for.
Thank you very much.